According to the National Archives, 12,618 UFO sightings were reported to Project Blue Book while it was headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Of these sightings, 701 cases still remain to this day unidentified. The Project Blue Book files were declassified after the project was closed in 1969. All of the files relating to UFO sightings were made available to view on microfilm within the National Archives. In the words of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, in the public's mind, UFOs seem to be synonymous with spaceships and visitors from outer space. Certainly a careful study of the more extraordinary and unexplained UFO cases, not only from the Air Force files, but from the more extensive files gathered today at the Center for UFO Studies, leaves little doubt that an intelligence of some sort is indeed operating behind the scenes on this planet. But the answer to the question of where did they come from, and of what kind of beings they are, still seem to elude many in the field of ufology. We must be extremely careful not to be too self-centered about this question. It is only too natural for us to think that all intelligence must necessarily be like our own. But this simply is not the truth. These beings visiting humanity are very different from you and I, and seem to have an agenda all their own. It is quite normal for the human response to want to argue or disagree with the facts about UFOs and the existence of these alien beings, especially when this truth can cause such a great fear. But as they say, the truth is out there, and the truth is, we are not alone. It is no argument that people are often mistaken about what they observe. Therefore, when reports were made by several witnesses to the same event, they were always given a higher priority, because each account can be measured against the others for accuracy. Still, it is impossible to vouch for the validity of each of the puzzling reports listed in the Project Blue Book files, even for those cases which I investigated myself and in which I became personally involved. The witnesses I interviewed could have been lying, could have been insane, or could have been hallucinating collectively. Although I do not believe so. Their standing in the community, their lack of motive for perpetration of a hoax, and their own puzzlement at the turn of events they believed they witnessed, and often their great reluctance to speak of the experience, all lend a subjective reality to their UFO experience. Strange apparitions in the sky have been reported on occasion throughout history. There was a UFO flap of considerable proportions in the United States in 1897 and 1898, and then again in Europe during World War II, in which these UFO sightings would come to be known as Foo Fighters. These illuminated balls would follow airplanes and were reported by pilots on both sides. There was also a rash of ghost rockets in the Scandinavian countries in 1946. But the year 1947 is generally credited as the year in which the modern wave of flying saucer, or UFO reports, really began. The early reports of UFOs were largely of discs observed during the daytime, or of strange lights seen at night. Close encounters or reports of UFO experiences in close proximity to the witness do not occur frequently in Blue Book files. The disc, ovals, and ellipsoid, or egg-shaped objects, were all objects known as flying saucers, because they generally looked somewhat like saucers, or more specifically, like two saucers pushed together, one overturned upon the other. And although other terms were used to describe them, the term flying saucer soon became popular with both the press and the public alike. The United States Air Force military was the arm charged with protecting the U.S. from any outside flying attacks, and was naturally given the responsibility of investigating these bizarre sightings, and for all the government knew, potentially fearsome aerial weapons.
There have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve.
It was only because flying saucers might pose a serious threat to national security that the Air Force regarded them in the beginning as a priority matter. It wasn't important whether the origin of the objects was from some other country here on Earth, or if they were from some other planet, or even some distant solar system. The fact was that they might be dangerous, and that was the only thing that concerned the Air Force.
Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step.
Though the Air Force paid lip service to the potential scientific advances that might derive from a study of UFOs, there were only two aspects of the UFO problem that really concerned them: whether or not UFOs were a threat to national security, and whether or not they were extraterrestrial. The Air Force satisfied itself rather quickly, stating that UFOs posed no threat to the United States, and after much internal and controversial discussions, it was also decided that there was no compelling evidence that UFOs were extraterrestrial in nature.
We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States.
Therefore, most of the work was done for the Air Force, or so they hoped. At that point, it would have been quite a vexing situation for the Air Force to have to deal with the continued flow of UFO reports if it had indeed been turned over to a scientifically oriented organization. In all fairness, the Air Force's primary responsibility to the nation is national defense and not abstract scientific research. Instead, the Air Force was stuck with the job, although it tried repeatedly over the years to foist this most unwelcome task onto some other governmental agency. In 1947, the first UFO reports were channeled to the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, the agency responsible for analyzing intelligence information of interest to the Air Force. When I became personally involved nearly a year later, I learned that there had been great consternation in the intelligence community over the sudden and seemingly preposterous series of reports that were coming in from both civilian and military quarters. The TIC could have easily discounted the civilian reports, and they generally did, but they could not just outright discount their own government-trained personnel and other military witnesses. This was a problem in the beginning. UFO reports were vague and sketchy, as I was to learn when I took on the responsibility of trying to explain as many as I could scientifically. The TIC just couldn't get the kind of hard data the military was used to getting. They wanted close-up photos, pieces of hardware, and detailed descriptions. Instead, a military pilot would report that he saw a metallic-looking object, possibly dish-shaped, or, in some cases, a wingless craft that the pilot would say buzzed him and then shot away at incredible speeds, and that was about all the reports consisted of. The Air Force's answer to these claims was usually the same: wingless craft nonsense. It couldn't be that perhaps the pilot had seen a meteor or had hallucinated. Undoubtedly, the pilot is confused, perhaps inhaling too much or too little oxygen, and since no one else had reported it, they could easily just write it off as a misperception of a natural event or phenomenon, and in some cases, they were labeled as a full-fledged hallucination within the confines of the Pentagon, where precision reports and snappy decisions were the rule. The TIC's bewilderment about UFOs was not very highly regarded by those in charge. In the meantime, two schools of thought about UFOs quickly developed. One school felt that UFOs should be taken very seriously. Their belief was so strong that a top-secret estimate of the situation was sent to Washington, stating that flying saucers were probably interplanetary and that the military should be put on an alert footing. Some didn't go as far as that, but were ready to accept that flying saucers were indeed real. General Twining of the United States Air Force wrote a letter to the commanding general of the United States Army Air Force as requested. In his letter, he wrote, The considered opinion of the command concerning the so-called flying discs. A. The phenomenon reported is something real and not just visionary. And B. There are objects approximately the shape of a disc of such an appreciable size, roughly the size of a man-made aircraft. In conclusion, we feel this threat to be real and should be addressed post-haste. The other school of thought took the much easier way out and summarily dismissed the entire subject as misperceptions. The top brass in Washington chose to adopt the latter view. It was much simpler, and after all, their scientific advisory board, composed of reputable and highly placed scientists, was hell-bent on the belief that such things just couldn't be real, and the only answer was that they had to be mirages or the result of plain good old-fashioned imagination. It was against all known science that a craft could behave in the manner attributed to UFOs' amazing accelerations, from a standing start, right-angle turns, and rapid movements. Noiseless disappearances openly defying gravity by hovering effortlessly above the ground. Scientists said that this was impossible, and when the Air Force theorem, which was to cause so much trouble later on, was born, it couldn't be. Therefore, reports continued to pile up at Wright-Patterson. After studying, analyzing, and evaluating 237 of the best reports, I found that 32% could be explained astronomically. Others who worked on the report found 12% to be balloons. Another 33% were listed as misidentified aircraft, hoaxes, or reports too sketchy to attempt evaluation. That left 23% that could not be identified or classified in any known categories. They were unknowns. That should have been considered extremely newsworthy, but hardly a peep was mentioned in the press. On December 17, 1969, the Secretary of the Air Force announced the termination of Project Blue Book. From 1947 to 1969, a total of 12,618 sightings were reported, of which 700 remain unidentified. The decision to discontinue UFO investigations was based on an evaluation of a report prepared by the University of Colorado entitled The Scientific Studies of Unidentified Flying Objects. A review of the University of Colorado's report by the National Academy of Sciences on past UFO studies, and the United States Air Force's experiences investigating UFO reports during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. As a result of these investigations, studies, and experience gained from investigating UFO reports since 1948, the conclusions of Project Blue Book are: Number 1. No UFO reported, investigated, or evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of a threat to our national security.
I'm sorry, I'm allergic to bullshit.
2. There has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge.
Bullshit. Bullshit.
3. There has been no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles.
Bullshit.
With the termination of Project Blue Book, the Air Force regulations establishing and controlling the program for investigating and analyzing UFOs were rescinded, and documentation regarding the former Blue Book investigation has been permanently transferred to the Military Branch National Archives. The termination of Project Blue Book was a direct result of scientists not having all the answers when pushed against the wall of proof. The proven sightings from various military personnel to high-level civil servants were quite indisputable. But Washington was looking for answers and was not satisfied with receiving the answers they were getting. The closing of Project Blue Book was the best way out of a bad situation. To this day, the military and government spend millions watching the skies, and still to this day, many of the objects the government is watching are UFOs, but the coat of arms is also still the same as it was in 1969. If they don't pose a threat to national security, then they don't concern the United States. This is the government's way of telling the public, yes, there are UFOs, but we still do not know what they are. This has been the Confidential Report. For even more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel today. And please show your support by clicking the like button on this video. For even more stories and news you deserve to know the truth about, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching The Confidential Report.